What if the only hope of the entire kingdom is a man who has lost everything? In this world, every knight is the last bastion fighting for survival. But what to do when the darkness is coming and there is no time or energy left? Meet Gruhorn, a knight whose determination is stronger than steel. When he fights monsters, he discovers more than just rage. Today, everything will change, and his story is just beginning. A white bird sits on swords surrounded by snow and bodies. Her eyes are fixed on the castle, where the wind is whistling between the walls. A figure in red appears in the distance, silhouetted against the background. The bird soars into the air, hovering over the battlefield, and its gaze is fixed on the man. He turns his head, his lips barely moving, but the wind blows his words away. Gruhorn stands in the cold wind, holding his sword tightly. He sees the orcs approaching, their faces lit up in red light. The knight raises his sword, preparing for battle. Orcs shout and brandish their weapons, their shadows growing in the snow. Gruhorn takes a step forward, aiming at the enemy, his sword flashing in anticipation of an attack. Gruhorn clutches his sword, and there are shouts and sounds of fighting all around. He quickly attacks enemies, cutting them with powerful blows. Flashes of light and sounds of collisions fill the air. Around him, fallen enemies fall, blood flooding the ground. The battle continues, and he doesn't know when the horror will end. Gruhorn stands on the battlefield, sword in hand, surrounded by destruction and flames. He looks at the approaching monster with red eyes, preparing to attack. The sword glints in the firelight, reflecting his determination. Gruhorn steps confidently through the rubble, his eyes burning with the desire to protect his world. Gruhorn stands on a snow-covered field, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. He stares at the ruined castle in the distance, the cold wind whipping at his cloak. Behind them, dark figures gather, ready to attack. The man clutches his sword, his face showing determination. He turns to face the approaching enemies, ready for the next fight. Gruhorn raises his sword, reflecting the bright light. The screams of his enemies ring out around him, and he grips the hilt tightly. The red-eyed monster charges, its fury ripping through the silence. Gruhorn's sword cuts through the air, leaving a trail of blood. Shadows of other opponents appear in the background, and their number is growing menacingly. The monster's screams resound all around, and they pounce furiously, showing their sharp teeth. Gruhorn's grip on his sword is tight, and his hand is shaking with the effort. He raises his weapon above his head and charges with determination. The sword glows with a blue light, leaving traces of energy in its wake. His eyes are bright, ready for battle. Gruhorn stands surrounded by snow, his face hidden in shadow. He glances at the fallen enemy lying on the ground. He rises, drawing his sword, and moves forward with determination. An army is forming up behind them, ready to attack. Gruhorn raises his sword, causing a powerful stream of blue energy to fill the air. Gruhorn races across the snow-covered field, his sword glinting in the bright light. He sees enemies preparing to attack and instantly turns around. The sword slashes through the air, and the enemy falls, leaving a trail of blood. Gruhorn continues the battle, his movements precise and fast. An ally appears from behind, ready to support you in battle. Gruhorn stands in the snow, clutching a sword covered in blood. He's looking at a giant creature that's snarling and tearing at the air. Chaos reigns all around, the sounds of battle filling the space. Gruhorn prepares for the attack, his face showing determination. The creature, full of rage, raises its hand to strike. Gruhorn grips his sword, preparing to attack. He looks at his opponent, his face full of determination. The enemy charges forward with a snarl, his eyes filled with hatred. Gruhorn takes a step forward, his movements precise and quick. Flames flare up in the background, illuminating their fight. Gruhorn stands on a snow-covered mountain, sword in hand covered in blood. The wind whooshes, whipping up swirls of snow around him. He looks at the endless mountains full of lightning and clenches his fist. His eyes burn with rage when he sees the monster with the creepy grin. Gruhorn growls and rushes forward. Gruhorn grips the hilt of his sword, blue and red bursts of energy flashing around him. He raises his sword and charges, leaving a bright trail behind him. A confident smile appears on his face. He looks at his friend and encourages him to follow him. There are thuds in the distance, ice shards flying apart. Gruhorn stands in front of a majestic castle, the sun illuminating the garden. He looks at the sword that glints in the light. The sword is mounted on a pedestal in a dark hall, with candles burning around it. A voice says his name. Gruhorn clenches his fist, tension building. Gruhorn is gripping the hilt of his sword, his eyes blazing with rage. He shouts that he is the master of this sword. Instead, the armored man stops, his hands shaking with the effort. Gruhorn prepares to attack, his brow covered with beads of sweat. Idrian clutches his sword, his face contorted with anger. He shouts, pointing at someone, his voice filled with rage. The sword sparkles, it demands to check your powers. A sign with its characteristics appears in the background. Determination burns in his eyes. Gruhorn clutches his sword, his face covered in sweat. He glares at his opponent, his teeth grinding with the effort. As if in a rage, he shouts about the stupidity of the opponent. The sword glints in the light, reflecting his anger. Gruhorn shouts, his voice breaking the silence. He bends sharply, pushing off the ground, and rushes forward. The knights raise their hands in panic, trying to stop him. One of them calls out to his highness, but Gruhorn doesn't stop. Gruhorn clutches his sword, his face contorted with anger. He attacks swiftly, delivering a blow that rips through the air. Another armored man shouts, his voice filled with fear. A woman in the distance covers her face with her hands, her eyes filled with terror. Gruhorn falls to his knees, blood pouring down his arms. He looks down at the wounded man lying there with his stomach pierced. There are cries for help from behind, and someone calls for the royal doctor. Gruhorn clenches his fists, his face contorted with pain. The prince eats hungrily, his face contorted with pleasure. The castle in the background sparkles with lightning, creating an ominous atmosphere. The servants whisper to each other, surprised that he doesn't turn the tables anymore. The prince sits on the throne, his eyes full of remorse. Gruhorn is sitting on the throne with a scowl on his face and his arms crossed. He asks a question about who is visiting him. The woman in the apron smiles, but the tension increases when the man in the red raincoat appears. He looks at her reproachfully. Gruhorn is sitting in a chair, clenching his fists with exertion. The man in the red raincoat turns to him with displeasure, his face contorted with anger. Gruhorn responds with disdain, his eyes full of disdain. The man turns abruptly, his voice sounding like a reproach. Gruhorn flinches, his eyes widening in shock. A man in luxurious clothes with a proud face indicates the lack of a greeting. The king stands surrounded by knights, his voice stern. Gruhorn sinks down on the couch, his body relaxed. Gruhorn is sitting on the bed, his face covered in beads of sweat. Next to him, a bespectacled man with an anxious expression on his face asks about the condition. Gruhorn clenches his fists, angrily replies that he's not going to give up. The king looks at them with deep concern. The king looks at the boy with a hard expression, his lips pressed together. The boy rubs the back of his head nervously, clearly confused. The knight next to the king tries to calm him down, talks about the need for calm. The king turns away, his eyes dark. Gruhorn stares at me in disbelief, clenching his fist. He touches the locket on his chest, tension building. The queen puts her arms around him, holding him close. She whispers about the return of memory. Gruhorn grimaces, his face contorted with confusion. A woman with